Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been discussing the growing humanitarian crisis for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In this half, we're discussing the politics behind the crisis. The Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan demanded that Israel lift the maritime blockade of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli government said that such a move was not under consideration. Meanwhile, Hamas, who control the Gaza Strip, have said that if international forces stationed in the Gaza Strip as part of a peace agreement, they would be treated as occupiers. So where do political relations with the Gaza Strip go from here? And what are the potential implications of nations like Turkey refusing to have relations with Israel over the blockade? Remaining with me to discuss this are Professor Bill Bowring, Amy Shallan and Dan Judelson. So, Amy, you were saying just before the break, and we were referring to the security situation, but perhaps it would be better to say the lack of security situation. But this is deteriorating in terms of the number of Palestinians that are losing their lives.
Not in terms of injuries, I would say. So Dan was mentioning the access restricted areas. Now, of course, there are farmers, there are all sorts of people who are in those areas who are fired on if they go into them, despite the fact that there are some people who have always had their homes there. And this year alone, in the last couple of months, we have seen half the amount of people injured as were injured for the entire year last year. So certainly things are ramping up in terms of cross-border fire. And of course, this has happened with the fishermen as well, is if they go outside the 6 nautical mile area or are somewhere near it, they also are at risk of being fired upon. And that is now being enforced by the Egyptian authorities too. So things are becoming very, very tense in that respect, and it is leading to further injuries and in some cases also fatalities.
Of course, Bill, it was the Mavi Marmara incident in, I think, 2010, where there was an attempt to run the maritime blockade that's engaged the Egyptian government in this, isn't it? Because the whole discussion is partly about compensation. The Turkish government, yes, indeed, about compensation for those Turkish nationals killed in the Mavi Marmara incident.
Yes, these are talks which were reported on last week. And as I mentioned very briefly in the first half, what seems to have happened is that the Turkish side have been saying that lifting the blockade is a condition for restoring normal relations between Israel and Turkey. Israel says, no, absolutely no way, and you've got to stop being so rude about us internationally. But what Israel is doing at the same time is to up the amount of money which they're prepared to pay by way of compensation. So there's an admission there, in a way, by Israel that what they did was wrong. And I think what they're hoping is that they can somehow buy Turkey off. But feeling is very high indeed, I would say, in Turkey and in the region as to what happened. And as for running the blockade, this was a very public international demonstration of outrage at what was going on. And it was done knowing that there would be an Israeli response, but not expecting there would be an Israeli response of the kind that we saw. Yes, exactly.
Dan, I mean, it's a remarkable situation, isn't it, in some ways, because as Bill says, this was an activist flotilla that was meant to, to dramatise the situation of the blockade, but it's now entered interstate politics. It's now become a matter of international diplomacy, and the Turkish government are essentially using the case to insist on a dismantling of the blockade. It's quite a remarkable development, really.
I think it's long been that way. I mean, it originally sort of blew up because of how rude. I mean, it's all very well saying Israel is complaining about how rude the Turks are being, but it initially blew up because of how rude Perez was to Erdogan in the discussion at the time of the incident. I think one has to also factor in a degree of Turkish domestic politics and see this as an issue that Erdogan can use to bolster his position amongst people with whom he's normally rather unpopular.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's an interesting point because, I mean, throughout the sort of Arab revolutions, the Turkish government has essentially been positioned in itself as the kind of European bridge into the new Middle East, and it plays, if that's not too cynical a term, it plays the anti-Israeli card very powerfully in that process, doesn't it?
This has been, I mean, by any international standard, Israeli diplomacy has been very sophisticated and very effective for a long period of time. And one of the pillars of that diplomacy was a near-neighbour policy, whereby it said we can't do anything about Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt and the countries immediately around us, so let's see if we can build relations with Turkey. And they used to be extremely good up until the time of the Mavi Mora incident. And the reason for the increased sums of compensation is that Israel really wants to restore its relations with a very important economic trading partner and a very important geopolitical neighbour. Turkey has one of the largest economies in the region, is developing and growing fast, has enormous influence in both Syria and other local conflicts, and Israel wants to be on good terms with it. It's not able to get back to those good terms. Israeli diplomacy in recent years has suffered from some very clumsy missteps.
Amy, I mean, you were saying in the first part about the effect of the change of government in Egypt. Now, without exaggerating how sympathetic the Brotherhood government was to the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, it is a significantly different regime now, isn't it?
It certainly is, and you know, I think there were great constraints on the Muslim Brotherhood as well in terms of how they controlled the Rafah crossing. However, since the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly things at that border have changed significantly. And we are seeing that in addition to the fact that the border has been closed quite often over the last few months or since July, we're also seeing the closure of the tunnels, which Gaza was really using as a lifeline until now. And as a result, I mean, we've had the Secretary of State for International Development talking in Parliament about real concerns that by the autumn we're going to see a Gaza that is without food, without water and without fuel. Now, while there's an acknowledgement that this is a really critical issue, we're not really seeing any action. And it's absolutely essential that we start seeing the politicians making the end of the blockade a priority. And that just hasn't happened as yet. And it has to.
Well, Dan, let me just ask you about that, because, you know, it's your organisation is Labour to Palestine. What impact do you see this developing crisis in Gaza having on the parliamentary outlook for speaking out on this question at any rate?
It is so much easier now to raise the issue with MPs. Taking people to the West Bank, we don't take people to Gaza at the moment, but taking people to the West Bank and showing them for themselves what conditions are like there, hearing direct from both grassroots and senior politicians about the political conditions that they are labouring under, excuse the pun, and bringing that information back. I think it's very important to understand that an MP will never gainsay first-hand information. If you say, I went to the West Bank and I saw this, they will not question what your own witness account. If you say, my friend went to the West Bank and he says they saw this, then you're already at too many removes. But the importance of taking people there and the way it feeds into parliamentary work, and this is true for all parties, for Liberal Democrats, Conservatives and for the Scottish Nationalists as well as Plaid Cymru and the other smaller parties, is that it is having an effect. You do get Secretaries of State standing up in Parliament in a way you would not have done maybe 5-6 years ago because it was seen to be too delicate a subject to address because the facts were rather unpalatable, to say the very least.
Bill, just to sort of for a moment, let's looking at the diplomatic situation that the State of Israel finds itself in. Now, in my mind, it was extraordinarily isolated at the time when it had an unsympathetic, shall we say, at least government in Cairo. We've talked about the situation with Turkey. It couldn't get the sort of hawkish response that it wanted out of the United States over Iran and still can't. How do you read it? Because I mean, the pressure on the Gazans is considerable, but their opponent isn't in the best shape diplomatically.
Do you mean the Israelis' opponent? Or I think the Israelis themselves are actually in an extremely difficult situation because things are so turbulent and so chaotic, very close to them. And I would say the situation in Turkey, as was mentioned by Dan just a few minutes ago, is that Erdogan feels obliged to appeal to the very large part of the Turkish population who feel sympathy for the Palestinians and are really outraged at the situation with Gaza. And I think the situation in Syria and in Lebanon actually doesn't help the Israelis at all. And what the Americans, on whom the Israelis so much depend, don't like is the fact that Israel is the center of a lot of this turbulence. So I would say, actually, that's one side of it. Another side of it is, when you said, I think earlier on, that Hamas controls Gaza, Hamas were actually elected in Gaza, I think is the point. Yeah. And Israel missed the chance to talk to Hamas at the point when they were elected. And actually Hamas has, or the part of Hamas has got entrenched in certain views, not surprisingly at all. And as I began to say just before the break, when the last conflict seemed imminent after Cast-Led, Israel was extremely reluctant to go in, I would say, because they have no idea what they would find if they go in there. I think this is a real change in the situation, by the way, and I think the experience that Israel had in South Lebanon some years ago, they are very worried that that might be repeated in Gaza. So I think this is it's an impasse. Of course it is at the moment, but I think it's an impasse in the context of an extremely fluid situation around Israel, and one where the Israeli government seems to me to be acting in a really hysterical fashion. I mean, for example, behaving so provocatively with new settlements at a time when a peace process is supposed to be going on, and at a time when, for all the difficulties, in fact, a Palestinian state is being increasingly recognized across the world.
I mean, Amy, it's a slightly odd situation because, I mean, we've been speaking probably for half an hour about this crisis now. There are times when there have been peace processes and peace talks going on when that would have been the centre of discussion. But I mean, I don't think anybody would say that we haven't been talking about essentials when we've not been talking about this. So what do you see the relationship between the deterioration on the ground and the fact that there is nominally, at any rate, a peace process going on?
Well, we've had 20 years since Oslo, and under the model of Oslo and a whole series of negotiations that have been in process and failed over time, there is a real feeling amongst the Palestinians that I meet that very little has come their way as a result of that whole process, and that the very model of Oslo has failed them. I mean, just from a health perspective, if we see what actually has happened to health services for Palestinians under that model, in many ways it has been wonderful that they have Palestinian health service that does very well and has actually improved in terms of greater access for people. But the political barriers to health have remained so strong, and now the division between the West Bank and Gaza means we have two ministries of health, and there is no unified system, no way to create that. That development is absolutely impossible beyond a certain point. And if you talk to people on the ground with these current negotiations going on, they don't really seem to think they're relevant to them in any degree at all. Very little has been publicised about them in any case, because the whole discussion has been a secret one, and possibly for good reason, that one should sort of keep that behind closed doors. But at the same time, it means that there is very little buy-in from people as well, or otherwise. And even if this framework agreement is successful, the real question is, if it's put to a Palestinian referendum, will it be accepted by the people? So, I mean, it's a very, I'd say it's not a very optimistic outlet at the moment.
Dan, is that how you read it? That, you know, of all the problems and of all the powerful factors that are shaping the fate of the Palestinians in Gaza, the peace process is pretty low down the list.
I think that's probably true at the moment. I think Emmy's absolutely right to point out that the Palestinians on the ground have very little buy-in to what they see as a deeply flawed process. It's not being sponsored by what they see, and indeed I have to agree, by an honest broker. You know, United States aid to Israel subsidises the occupation itself, and it is quite odd that while I admire John Kerry's efforts in getting people back to the negotiating table, you need a far more neutral facilitator of these talks for them to be successful, as the leaks about the framework agreement suggest, and indeed as John Kerry's own statement that he's prepared for people to disagree with his framework. He needed to put that in for political wriggle room, otherwise the framework agreement would have been and may still be dead on the table the moment it's written. Certainly the way it's suggested at the moment, no Palestinian could sign it. No Palestinian diplomat could sign it. It'd be like Michael Collins in Ireland in 1916.
So look, Dan, if we were to sort of sum up what the discussion has said so far, it would be this: that there's a toxic, literally and politically, situation for Gazans, that the blockade is worse than it's ever been, that Israel is diplomatically isolated, that the peace process, it says, is going nowhere. Bill's described it as an impasse, but it's an impasse that's almost certain to break down. In which direction do you see it breaking down?
That's only a $64,000 question. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that international diplomatic pressure is going to increase on the Israelis. Bill mentioned earlier that when Hamas was elected, as it was, there was a mistake made by the Israelis in refusing to talk to it, but that was a mistake repeated at Israel's behest by the rest of the world. I don't know any politician, and I write and negotiate with them from time to time, who now thinks that the isolation of Hamas in Gaza after the free and fair elections was a wise move in diplomatic terms. It was a missed opportunity, and I think that the international diplomatic community is going to do its level best not to repeat what they wisely acknowledge as a mistake. I think the other thing that makes me think that the international community is going to sort of put increasing pressure on Israel is that you hear more and more from senior diplomats off the record or in private briefings that this is the very last chance for a two-state solution. Now, plenty of people have been saying that for some time. Plenty of people think that the last chance has gone. But it's the level at which that's now being said that makes me think that the Europeans and possibly the Americans will put more pressure on Israel, and we may see some kind of... I mean, the British government recently said don't do business with settlements. I think we'll see more advice being given to businesses like that, and it will send the Israeli government something of a frenzy. One has to acknowledge that they themselves have a very fragile coalition, as we saw recently with people shouting at the President of the EU Parliament, and with 10,000 people, including Liquid ministers, marching to E1 saying we have to build here, which would be a definite end to a two-state solution. It renders a Palestinian state unviable.
Okay. So, Amy, I mean, the status quo is a bit, as it exists at the moment, is a bit like watching a levitation act. It stays up there, but you can't see how. How do you think that situation is liable to develop?
Well, I mean, the way the situation has continued to stay the way that it has is actually an issue of aid dependency as well. So certainly under the blockade, we have seen increasing aid dependency. And now something like 57% of the population are food insecure. And as a result, I think because there are so many other pressures now on international donors with what's happening in Syria in particular, then that whole question of how the international community funds the situation and continues, the EU and America particularly, how that continues to be held, I think it's going to be called into question, and that is the financial aspect is where I think it will begin to make a difference, actually.
Okay, Bill, so you're the last one with the crystal ball. What's going to happen next?
Well, I think the factor which hasn't been mentioned so far is the demographic factor, because the point at which Ariel Sharon pulled the very few Israeli settlers out of Gaza and went hell for leather building the wall was the point at which actually the demographic balance in Israel plus occupied territories tipped. And the fact of the matter is that the Arab population in Jerusalem not only hangs on tenaciously but grows quite fast, plus the population of Israeli Arabs, of the Arabs who are Israeli citizens, and we already know today how the population in Gaza is growing. And really, I think that is what also puts enormous pressure on the Israeli government, that they will, if Gaza is running out of time, so is the Israeli government running out of time if they want to keep a theocratic Israeli state and the Jewish state in the region, as a matter of fact. And I think that accounts for the element of desperation on the Israeli side.
OK, well, you've heard what my guests think about the future of the situation for the Gaza Strip and for Palestinians. The great thing about making predictions, of course, is that they're almost certainly wrong. So you'll have to watch future editions of Analysis when we find out what actually happens to the fate of the Palestinians in future episodes. Do join us.